and welcome to Women's Health. My name is Kathie Uhrmacher. I currently serve as the chair of the Mayor's Commission on Women. I am also the president of the Women's Foundation, and women's health programs are funded by Women's Foundation. I'd like to introduce my guest today. This is Kimberley Taylor-Riley, who is the Director of Equity and Diversity, I got to get that right, and also is the Executive Director of the Lincoln Commission on Human Rights. So I'm really glad to have her with us today, and today we're going to be talking about fair housing, and specifically the discrimination that can happen sometimes when women and/or women and families are searching for housing in Lincoln, both either when they're renting or when they're looking for something to buy. So Kimberley, why don't you start out first of all telling us a little bit about your role as the Director of Equity and Diversity, and then maybe a kind of an extenuation of that, what is the Commission on Human Rights?
Well, first off, thank you for having me. This
You're
is
welcome.
Very exciting. We got a grant from Housing and Urban Development. We are a contractor with Housing and Urban Development, and they gave a grant for outreach. And so this is part of our outreach. So I'm really excited to be doing this. I serve as the Director of Equity and Diversity for the City of Lincoln. What that means is I have several different tasks that they've kind of cobbled together in one role. But that Executive Director of Lincoln Commission on Human Rights is the outgrowth of that. So in addition to overseeing the Commission on Human Rights, I'm also the City EEO officer, and I have several other tasks that I'm responsible for within the city. But I'm here today with respect to the Lincoln Commission on Human Rights.
So today we're going to be talking about fair housing, and I assume that this is fair housing for everyone, but we're specifically going to be talking about women who go to either rent something, I would assume a house or an apartment, or also when they go to purchase a house. Should we talk about renting separate from purchasing?
No, they really are. The rights are the same.
The rights are the same. Okay, good point. So then let's talk about what are some of the barriers that women sometimes have when they go to look for housing.
Well, one of the things that we are trying to do outreach for is what we're kind of categorizing as women and underserved populations. What we're doing is trying to get the word out because people tend to not know exactly what their rights are. What we're talking about are things that happen when, say, you go to rent an apartment and it's yourself and two small children.
Okay.
And maybe because of your financial situation, you can only afford a one-bedroom apartment. So you're looking at one-bedroom apartments. You go and you view the apartment, you're interested in it, and you want to rent it. Filling out the paperwork, you qualify, you can afford to pay for it, and the landlord says, well, you want to have how many people? You say, well, it'll be me and my two small kids. Well, but you're only getting a one bedroom. Well, they're small kids, so they're going to sleep in the same room with mom. Yeah, I won't rent to three people for one bedroom. If I'm going to rent to you, you'd have to rent a larger apartment. So we have that happen sometimes, and financially, a lot of times people can't afford to go up. Plus, when the children are small, usually one can sleep in the bed with mom, one's going to be in a crib.
Okay.
It's not really going to be a problem to have three people in that apartment. But if the landlord says, no, I'm going to restrict that, if they come in and they talk with us, one of the things we would do is have it what we call tested. And there are agencies that will do testing for us. We usually use the Fair Housing Assistance Program out of Omaha, and they work for Nebraska and Iowa. And what they will do is they will kind of call up and do a test by phone. So they'll have someone call up and say, I am, a person that wants to rent this apartment, and it's maybe me and my boyfriend. So it'll be two adults. And they say, oh yes, we'll show you the apartment, this is how much it rents for, and give you all of the information. Then they'd have a tester call and say, I'm a single parent with two kids and I'd like to rent a one-bedroom apartment from you. And then when landlord says, oh no, that's too many people for that apartment, we wouldn't do that, then we get that testing information back, and that's one of the things that we use to support the case in favor of there being discrimination against them. And that would be under what they would call familial status. This is a mother with children versus a couple.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Do landlords have the right then to limit the number of people that they rent to based on the size of the apartment?
They can, but it's not something that's legislated. And a lot of times landlords will just say, well, the space just isn't large enough.
Okay.
And so we've decided that this is what we want to do.
Okay.
Now, obviously, if it's 5 adults and it's a 1-bedroom apartment, I don't think anybody would say, oh, yes, that sounds like a fabulous plan. But when you're talking about, especially when you're talking about single parents with children, that's why
Right.
the code is sensitive
Right.
to that, because that tends to happen to those folks more frequently. And again, a lot of times it has to do with the stereotypes that go along with that, and the landlord's presupposition that this person isn't going to be reliable or isn't going to be able to pay their rent, or whatever
Right.
other stereotypes they have that are going
Right.
along with that.
Right. So they're imposing a policy that's basically arbitrary and really unfair.
Exactly, because if what you're saying is it's okay for 2 adults to be there, but it's not okay for an adult with 2 small children, what's the real difference?
Right,
It's still
exactly.
a 1-bedroom apartment and you've got 2 people in it or 3 people in it.
Exactly. So when you mentioned before underserved populations, what does underserved populations mean?
Normally what we mean by that are folks that just aren't aware of our services. So a lot of times it's new Americans or refugees, people who are new to the area, people who are not necessarily, maybe didn't get all the way through high school, so they're not really familiar with all of the services that might be available. So when we talk about underserved populations, it's not a specific defined group.
Okay.
It's any group that doesn't happen to know that we exist and that we can help them. So
or
we consider
sometimes
that
don't
underserved.
seek out services,
Exactly.
probably. So they need to know that there are services available. And that's great. This program is really helping. Let's talk about some other cases, some things that come up. What are other examples of times when someone goes to apply for housing and has been discriminated against?
Well, a lot of times what you'll end up with is people who will be in a circumstance and they'll say, it just didn't seem right. And they'll say, I didn't come in and file a complaint with anyone because I thought, well, I don't have any proof. It just seemed odd to me. And we try to encourage people to come in and tell us about those things, because while they may not think that they have any evidence or any proof, that's what we do. So we certainly are here to try to find out if there's any evidence or any proof to support that maybe what seemed odd really wasn't just odd. It might have actually been discriminatory.
Right. So let me ask you specifically for women. I think that sometimes when we talk about the whole scope of women, particularly maybe women in poverty, sometimes there's sort of a insinuation, hey, I'll rent you this apartment if you're willing to do certain things. Does that happen? Is that something that you see?
Sadly, it does happen. And there was a case that was investigated out of the Omaha Regional Office. It wasn't a case out of our office, but they found exactly that. And young ladies were renting in a particular complex, and there was one person that had come in and registered her complaint saying that she was literally being asked for what they call quid pro quo, a favor for a favor. So I will rent this apartment to you for $100 less a month if you will do this for me.
Okay.
And what these young ladies were reporting, or this young lady reported, was that that was the circumstance under which this landlord was now coming to her and telling her, okay, we agreed to this, now it's time for you to do your part of the bargain. And she was very uncomfortable, obviously, with that, so she had come in and registered the complaint. Unfortunately, of course, the landlord denied that any such thing was going on, and there wasn't really a way to break the tie. She was saying, yes, that was going on. He was saying, no, it wasn't. So what they had done is gone to that particular complex and gone pretty much door to door and knocked on the door and talked to the residents that they could find there. And through doing that, were able to find, I think, 3 or 4 more complainants that were in the same circumstance.
Wow.
So it was going on.
So when something like that happens and it is reported, okay, somebody comes to you here in Lincoln and says, this is a situation that I'm in, what then does your office do? What are the steps?
Normally what happens is we'll have an initial screening of them, and that's usually done by phone. They'll call in, or they can go online at our website, and there's an area on there where you can click a link and you can fill in, it's kind of an informational sheet that gives us at least some background as to what it is you're thinking is the concern. That will then be transmitted electronically to our office, and one of the investigators will receive it. And after they've reviewed it, they will call that person at the contact number that they provide. They'll do the screening by phone, and then they'll set up a time. If it looks like they have a colorable claim, they'll set up a time for them to come in and meet. When they come in and meet with the investigator, they will go over kind of the full background of what is going on. And then they take all of that information, they enter it into our computer system because we're actually contractors with HUD and also with the EEOC. So we enter that information into the electronic database, and then we have those folks come back and sign a formal complaint and get their signature notarized, and that starts the process actually going. Once the process is underway, the people that are accused, the housing provider that is being accused of discrimination of some sort, will then get a copy of that complaint, and they'll also get a request for them to turn over documentation and for them to send us a response. They usually get 20 days to do that. After that happens, then the investigators will have the complainant come back in, talk to them about the information that's been provided by the housing provider, and then the investigation gets underway. Once the investigation is completed, there's a report that's generated. I will review the report after the investigators complete it. Once that happens, it ends up going to our commissioners. We have 9 voluntary commissioners that meet once a month. They review all of this documentation. They have their opportunity at the open hearing to talk with the investigators. So if they have questions about what was in the investigation, or maybe something they thought should have been asked or should have been done that wasn't done, that's their chance to ask about it. If they feel like they have sufficient information, they discuss the case and decide what they think, and then they vote on whether or not there's reasonable cause to believe that discrimination has occurred. Once that happens, the commission's done with their part of it, and they sign off on whatever, the chair will sign off on whatever decision was made. And then from there, it either, if there's a cause finding, it can go to hearing, or the person, either one of the people, as a matter of fact, can elect to have it go to the district court, and they can file in the district court. If you get a no reasonable cause finding, you'll still get a letter that says this is the outcome at the commission, and the individual can still take it to court and file it if they choose to. So they can get counsel and file even if they get a no reasonable cause finding. So either way, they can take it to court if they choose to.
Okay, so there are legal consequences if there has been some kind of cause.
Yes. Yes, and there is usually a legal consequence in that the commission will say, okay, we want this to go to hearing. We think there's reasonable cause, so we think it should go to the next step. If it goes to public hearing, we get a hearing officer who actually hears the evidence, and we have one of the city attorneys put the evidence on, and they have kind of a mini hearing on the case, and all of the evidence is kind of put out in front of the administrative law judge. If the administrative law judge says, yes, I believe there's reasonable cause to believe that there's discrimination, then the next step is for it to go to the district court. We also try to conciliate at each juncture, so we're always trying to get the matter settled if we can.
Outside of court.
Exactly, but if we can't, then it just continues to go up to the next level. So if it comes out at administrative hearing that yes, he believes that there's reasonable cause, then there are sanctions are entered at that point, because then he makes recommendations, he or she I should say makes recommendations, and then the commission will pass on those and say yes, we think that this is reasonable, and then from there it can go to the district court on appeal, or we go ahead and try to go forward and enforce the judgment against them for whatever the commission has entered.
Do you think that people are concerned about coming to report things? Like, for example, you mentioned immigrants or refugees who come to Lincoln and they may have a situation of discrimination. Do you find that sometimes they're concerned about coming to you to even report it?
Well, I think that's part of the disconnect that we have. When people come from other countries and other cultures, generally their government isn't the place they go to redress difficulty.
Right.
So we're in kind of a unique situation because we're a government office, but we're in place to actually enforce civil rights. So it's very hard to make people necessarily understand that those two things are together, but at the same time they're divorced. So a lot of times people are fearful just to try to take advantage of any kind of government offering, because they feel like once they've turned over information to the government, that can somehow be used against them.
But that's why this program is so important, because we want to get the news out that these things are available. These services are definitely available. So I think that's really important. Let's talk about examples where the sale of a house has been involved, maybe some kind of a mortgage or something that might have been an issue for someone.
What we have seen is that there are all kinds of issues surrounding mortgages. But what we had seen kind of when we talked about the mortgage bailouts that were going on, we were talking about just renting to people who didn't have the ability to pay. And over time, when they mapped that out, what they found is it tended to happen more in minority communities.
Now, you mean renting or selling?
This was selling. This was with mortgages.
Okay, you said renting, so I wanted to
I'm
clarify
sorry.
that.
With mortgages.
With mortgages, okay.
They were saying it was happening more in minority communities, such that there were these minority families that couldn't qualify probably for a loan, but they were given these loans anyway with that kind of balloon piece that came on later. And so they, needless to say, were foreclosed on years down the road. And when they mapped it out, what they found was in those minority communities, especially in larger cities, that was where most of it happened.
I see.
When we're talking about it being related to women, what we've seen are things that relate to discrimination for things like pregnancy. There was a case involving Wells Fargo. And what happened with Wells Fargo was that they would be in the process of approving someone for a mortgage loan. They've turned over all their documentation. You know, the process takes time. So as they're getting towards the end of the process, they find out that the woman is either already on maternity leave or she's maybe a few weeks from going on to maternity leave. She's pregnant, she's going to deliver the baby in about another month. They then started refusing to loan those women money so they wouldn't make good on the loans for the homes. And when they inquired, why are you doing this? They said, well, you're going to have a baby, so that means you're not going to be working. Well, I'm not going to be working for, 6 or 8 weeks, whatever it was. And they said, well, still, you're never sure. And sometimes, women don't come back to work after they have babies. So that was the reason not to give out loans. One of the cases that was principal in that case was a woman who was a medical doctor, and she was married. So her husband had income independent of hers. She had her own income, and even with that, they still were refusing to give them the mortgage so that they could buy the home.
Wow.
So those kinds of things were going on. That ended up costing Wells Fargo, I want to say, $1.5 million in 2005. But they had cases leading up to that, so I don't want to leave it out there as though Wells Fargo was alone. There were a number of cases leading up to that, and I think that over the 5 years or so leading up to that was worth another $2 million or so dollars in
so
other banks. So
it wasn't just that particular group, but it was other financial institutions as well.
Yes, and that was all happening to women. Now that we have specific pregnancy legislation here in the state of Nebraska that protects pregnant women and requires accommodation during their pregnancy, that's also information we're trying to get out, because a lot of people aren't aware that they have protections when they're pregnant or due to deliver, or if they're fired from their job because they have to go out on maternity leave. A lot of folks aren't aware of that either, so we're trying to make sure people know that too.
I noticed that you mentioned the EEOC. Do you want to tell people what that is?
Oh, it's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and we contract with them because, like we contract with HUD to do housing cases, we contract with the EEOC to do employment cases.
So this would be in a case where someone is discriminated against because of pregnancy.
Right, when they get fired from work.
So that would be the EEOC.
Right, or fired, or they're not accommodated for some reason, that falls under that employment umbrella. But when we're talking about the housing and the pregnancy and then not getting the mortgages, then that's on the housing side.
Another instance that I remember you talking about was when people are coming back from substance abuse.
Yes.
And that there have been some discrimination cases. Would you just talk about that for a little bit?
Well, one of the things that's considered a disability is if you have an addiction. So a lot of times what happens to folks is they're either applying, for an apartment because, maybe they've been in treatment. And so they haven't been renting anywhere because they've been in treatment for a period of time, and now they're coming out of treatment and they're ready to get their own housing.
Sure.
So in the event that you discriminate against them because of their disability, that also is something that is protected by the civil rights laws.
That's really important to know. I think all of these are very important cases for people to understand that these are situations where they really do have a right to say, hey, wait a minute, this is really not fair. So that's really important. If you think about cases here in Lincoln, what kind of cases do you see the most often when it comes to fair housing or discrimination in housing?
Usually it's going to be in rental. circumstances. I don't think we've had a mortgage-related case since I've been there.
Okay, so mostly when it comes to renting.
Usually it's renting.
And how often do cases get reported? I mean, if you were looking back over the last year or so, do you have quite a few, or what would you call quite a few, I guess? I mean,
well, it depends, because it's like everything else, it's cyclical. So you may have a higher number of employment cases one year and a lower number of housing cases, and then the next year they might flip.
Sure.
So it kind of really depends. I think the employment cases have a lot more to do with how comfortable people are in the economy and in their job, because you're a lot less likely to complain about your job if you're worried that you're going to lose it than you are if you're pretty comfortable. With housing, it's a little bit different. Usually what people complain about is either I didn't get rented to, I was qualified and they wouldn't rent to me, or you get the other side of that, which is I have been living here for 5 years and I've never had any difficulty, but I ended up injuring my leg. And so I have mobility trouble now, and I'm still trying to heal from that. Doctor says it's going to be 6 months, maybe a year, because I really broke the bone severely. I'm asking for an accommodation, and then I'm asking to be moved from my 3rd floor apartment to a garden level apartment because I can't go up and down the stairs. And I can't get my landlord to move me. He's refusing to accommodate me. So we get a lot of those too. Sure. So sometimes it's just that change of circumstance. Everything was fine up until this point, and then I had a problem and I tried to ask for them to work with me and they wouldn't.
I see. What about as far as actual situations within an apartment? Like, let's say, for example, that someone is renting and they don't have a working stove, or they don't have a working furnace, or something goes wrong and the landlord refuses to repair that. Is that a fair housing or discrimination question?
It depends. It can be. We've had cases where that was the circumstance, but in order for it to qualify, what has to happen is landlord has to do repairs for one group but not for the other group. So say I'm saying it's happening because of my gender. There's a male down the hall who's had difficulty with his apartment, had the same problem I had, and they were there the next day and fixed it. But I'm a female and I made that complaint, and it's been 3 weeks and they still haven't come. So then I'd be saying, well, it's discriminatory based on my gender, because I know that they service the male and they wouldn't take care of the issue for me and I'm female. Sometimes we have it as it relates to national origin or ethnicity, and it's that same kind of thing. But there has to be that group of people that he's doing it for and that group of people he's not doing it for. We do have some landlords who just aren't very good landlords, for lack of a better term. And so what happens is they don't repair anybody's stuff, and it doesn't matter who registers the complaint, they just never come out and fix it. And if that's the case, they may be a bad landlord, but they're not necessarily discriminating. They may treat everybody badly, but they're treating everybody the same.
And so in that case, they wouldn't really have a recourse through your office?
Not through our office, but they can certainly call, building and safety if it's a health or a safety issue. We've had folks certainly that have called up, especially this time of year, if there's a hole in the roof so that you can't keep the house heated, or maybe the lights have been turned out. We had a couple people that called us when the electricity was turned off, because they pay the landlord an amount of money for the electricity, and the landlord has to pay LES, and the landlord hadn't paid. And so LES turned off the electricity, and so the people were in the apartment with no electricity. So it wasn't because they didn't pay their bill, it was because the landlord didn't pay his, but that becomes a health and safety issue at this time of year.
Right, so building health and safety rather than your
rather than our
department.
office. But we're happy to refer people. If they call us up and it doesn't happen to be something we can help them with, we'll certainly refer them to the next agency that we think might be able to address their needs.
Okay, good. So if someone is watching our program and they have a concern, they think perhaps they have been in a situation like what you've described today, what is the best thing for them to do? What's the best way to contact you or your office? What kind of resources are there for them?
Well, they can do it a couple of ways. They can certainly call our office. We're a city office. We're at 402-441-7624, and that's our main office exchange. So if it's after hours or on a weekend, you can leave a message and we'll get in touch with you on the first business day after we get back. You can also access us online at lincoln.ne.gov. And we are, if you go through the departments, we're kind of under city law, so you may have to hunt around a little bit for us, but we're under human rights. When you get to our webpage, there's also an opportunity on there to click a form, and you can fill out a form and let us know of what issues you're having, and then we can get back in touch with you with the contact information that you leave for us. Obviously, we're contractors. So in the event that it's someplace outside of the city of Lincoln, or maybe it's Lancaster County, but it's not city of Lincoln. We've had people call and say, for instance, I was trying to rent an apartment in Crete. And it's like, oh, I understand, but Crete's outside of our jurisdiction because we only have the city of Lincoln. They can certainly contact the HUD regional office, which is in Omaha. And I'm sorry, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but they can certainly contact them, or they can contact the federal U.S. Housing and Urban Development, and they can help them also. So they have several options in terms of getting their needs met here.
Okay, great. And then I noticed that you also have an email. Can they email you also?
They can. I believe it's lchr@lincoln.ne.gov.
Okay, well, we'll put that on the screen.
Okay.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. It's such an important issue, and we're glad to be able to get the information out. I want to thank Kimberley Taylor-Riley, who is here today from the Office of Education, Equity and Diversity, and also the Commission on Human Rights. And this has been women's health. And you might think, well, how does that fit with women's health? But what we really tried to do at the Women's Foundation is to give our community an idea of things that impact women and their families in their lives. And that includes health, but certainly housing is one of those things. So we thank you very much for joining us today. This has been Women's Health.